Hi. Welcome to the first journal club for scientific microservices. I'm Jay Pitchforth, and this is Jack Davis. We're the CTO and CEO of Scientific Microservices. Today we're going to do one of our favorite papers that we've talked about quite a lot, which is called Primary, Secondary, and Meta-Analysis of Research by Jean Glass, which is a 1977 paper. 1976, sorry, November 1976. So almost 77. I almost got that right. And yeah, you introduced this paper. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the context of it and why you wanted to share this paper?
Yes, I would like to start with a quote, if I may, from Professor Glass. He says, "Most research criticism I read, and some that I've written, is airy speculation, unbefitting an empirical science. It is an empirical question whether well-designed and poorly designed experiments give very different findings. At any rate, I believe the difference to be so small that to integrate research results by eliminating the poorly done studies is to discard a vast amount of important data." Those quotes are in the paper. It is quite sarcastic. That is Professor Glass writing this paper, Primary, Secondary, and Meta-Analysis of Research, in the mid-1970s. Professor Glass is an educational psychologist and a statistician, and here he's talking about the problem of how to interpret scientific research at scale. This cuts deeply to the core of scientific philosophy. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that how a scientist thinks about research at scale reveals a lot about their fundamental scientific approach. And it continues to be a mystery for data scientists today. As research scales, as we can use technology to run thousands of experiments per minute on people, the question of how to interpret those results in aggregate is far from settled. I would say it's more difficult than it's ever been. I would like to talk about a why question that Professor Glass kind of touches on, but a lot of other papers on meta-analysis go into more detail, which is why to integrate research findings at all. Because the argument that you hear is we don't do the same experiment more than once, so there's no point in trying to combine experimental results. We don't need to.
Yeah, we've got the answer. We did a test, we got the answer. What's the problem?
And we're not going to do the same thing again exactly, so why would we bother integrating answers at all? This is, of course, an argument that's been made before in offline science decades ago. The story that's used to address it is not mine. It's used in the opening to a textbook on meta-analysis called Introduction to Meta-Analysis, which is a fantastic book I highly recommend. They tell a story about sudden infant death syndrome. In the 1950s, a best-selling book on baby care wrote that babies should be put to sleep on their stomachs. This book sold 50 million copies well into the 1990s. The book was not the only source of this advice. Many pediatricians made similar recommendations at the time. More than 100,000 babies died during this period from sudden infant death syndrome, also called cot death, an unbearably sad thing where a seemingly healthy baby goes to sleep and doesn't wake up. In the 1990s, researchers concluded that the risk of sudden infant death syndrome was at least 50% lower when infants were put to sleep on their backs, rather than face down. Educational campaigns encouraged parents to put babies to sleep on their backs, and this led to an immediate and dramatic drop in the number of SIDS deaths, cot deaths. And to quote from Borenstein's book here, "While the loss of 100,000 children would be unspeakably sad in any event, the real tragedy lies in the fact that many of these deaths could have been prevented." In fact, there was scientific evidence available from the 1970s that putting babies to sleep on their front was likely to be harmful. For 20 years, the wrong advice was given to parents, just because nobody bothered to review the science that had already been done. An analysis in 2005 suggested that a systematic review of risk factors for SIDS could have led to earlier changes that would have saved at least 60,000 babies from dying.
60,000, yeah. There you go.
Not everything is as urgent as infant health.
Yeah.
But everything that we do in the name of science does carry a consequence. So that's why I care about this.
Yeah. So that's talking about specifically like the importance of combining research, right? So I think from all those quotes I'm getting, essentially they were throwing out a lot of studies that were too small on their own. But if you started combining them into stuff, then you started seeing a picture that you wouldn't have seen previously. And if they'd just done that method, which was available to them, it's like 60,000 babies being saved, which makes it worth learning some maths for, I reckon. So to bring it back to the paper, I think that's a really good reason, obviously, to be talking about it. And obviously, people can probably think of like 1,000 different other cool, or not cool, other important reasons to be able to do this sort of stuff in their own fields. In the paper, Glass starts off talking, the paper is called Primary, Secondary, and Meta-analysis. So could you maybe define what those different types of analysis actually mean?
Yeah, so primary analysis is the original analysis of data from an experiment or a research study. It is what you typically would imagine as the application of statistical methods or machine learning to a result. Secondary analysis is the reanalysis of existing data for the purpose of answering a new question. So you've collected data for one type of experiment, but in doing so you also collected some extra information that you can now use, or you can use a different method to get more results out of that data.
So would most of what we see on like online data, model training, right? That data is not being collected for any particular experimental reason. It's usually in the course of a business or some sort of operation, right? Does that mean that most of what we're talking about in data science is secondary analysis, essentially?
I would say much of the time it is, yeah. It's you're analyzing data that's been collected for a different purpose.
Yeah.
So primary analysis would typically be, I've collected information about costs and I'm analyzing it to see where my costs are. And I've collected this data to do this analysis. So the data and the analysis are perfectly linked like that, in theory. Secondary analysis is I've collected the data for some other purpose and now I've thought of a new purpose, a new question that I want to ask, or the same question but I've got a different method, or maybe I've got an enrichment data source or something like that. That would be secondary secondary analysis.
Yeah. And so then the next one that he talks about is meta-analysis.
As Professor Glass says, not for want of a less pretentious name. Meta-analysis refers to the analysis of analyses. It is the statistical collection and analysis of a large number of results from individual studies for the purpose of integrating the findings. So it doesn't just use lots and lots and lots of primary data sets or secondary data sets. What it uses is the results of previous analyses.
Yeah, right.
So that instead of needing to have all of the individual data, you can have a summary result from many different places, and the purpose of this type of science is to integrate those results.
Awesome. So meta-analysis then really is like, he talks about it as if he's going to talk about all three, but he doesn't really talk about primary or secondary. We're really talking about meta-analysis in the rest of this paper, and thus why that context is so important for why meta-analysis and the combination of research is such an important thing to do, right? And in the case of Glass, he starts off talking about the application of education.
That's his field.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I didn't actually know that. And you actually mentioned before, which I don't think we've talked about on camera, which is that this is actually a speech. It's not a...
Yes.
So do you know who the speech was actually to?
Yes. Where does it say?
University of Colorado Laboratory of Educational Research is where Gene Glass is from, or was from back in 1975.
This paper is the text of the author's presidential address to the 1976 annual meeting of the American Educational Research Association in San Francisco. So it is for educational psychologists. to explain to them why it might be useful to look at back. Remember that story I
think
told you about the risk factors for SIDS being discovered in the 90s? So this speech is from the 70s.
Yeah.
This is not from after they had all this evidence that actually doing it this way was helpful. This is from somebody at the forefront of trying to develop a way to do this because they saw that there was a gap and that there was this huge inefficiency and that information was being lost. And it would be decades later before they were vindicated by some of these really impactful findings. But you can see already here, he's saying, we have to do something else. This is already a problem.
Yeah, it's such a common story in science to have people just screaming out about something for so long and then nobody pays attention until it's a bit late. Look, bringing it back to the paper then, we talk about education and research, and he mentions a couple of great points, which I think are actually like quite almost cute in the current day, right? Like, so basically he talks about how, what we've done, he sets it apart from narrative review and how, and the point he wants to make here is that like narrative review doesn't work anymore because we just have too many papers about something. Keep in mind, 1975, right? Like, now we have about the same amount of papers come out every day that we had every year back when he was writing this or speaking about this. So could you talk a little bit about what narrative review means and how it is different to meta-analysis and how it's limited in that regard? I think that'd be...
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Professor Glass has some good quotes on this too. So I'm just trying to find them to give myself a starting point. But to start with, narrative review is the traditional way of assimilating scientific information, which is a clever person who has a lot of education and experience in the topic, reads a lot of research papers and results, and integrates them like any essay. It's I'm going to review the available evidence on this topic. I'm going to read a lot of papers on it, and then I'm going to write down a summary of what they say, and I'm going to include in that usually some evaluation of this evidence. I'm going to say there's this many papers that find one result, there's this many papers that this many papers find for, this many papers find against, but I personally think that the papers that find for are not as methodologically sound as the papers that find against. So on balance, I think we can't really say. Like, that would be a pretty typical, if you typed into ChatGPT, please write me a narrative review of these research papers, that is probably what it will say. That is just like the standard. And so what you typically get out of these kinds of review papers is a quick overview of the topic, an update on where the science is at, and then a little bit of expert commentary from the writers. So they're really, really helpful resources in science, narrative reviews, and they're really useful. But they have a few flaws that can make a narrative review less useful when there are too many studies for one person.
Being so careful, all of it,
They're very prone to bias. The bias of the writer. And often scientists like to pretend that we don't have any opinions about what the correct answer is from a study, but we usually do. And so it is hard for people to not just, as Professor Glass says here, take the results that... Have you got a quote?
To take it off your shoulders here, we'll let Professor Glass say it instead, which is, a common method of integrating several studies with inconsistent findings is to cap on the design or analysis deficiencies of all but a few studies, those remaining frequently being one's own work or that of one's students or friends, and then advance the one or two acceptable studies as the truth of the matter. I think that summarizes it, right? I think that's...
he states it very nicely. I was trying to say it any other way.
Yeah, no, well, that makes sense, right? Like, because you see it everywhere, I think, is the thing. And it's a common thing throughout all of science, without mentioning too many names, right? Like, we've both seen personally in academic research, people having kind of this weird academic battle between each other of those methodological arguments. Right, and argue, like, some of those have gone on since the 70s, right? and still, and people.
I think anybody with a scientific background or training will be able to summon to mind some examples of people for whom the studies that get the answer that they like are good studies, and the studies that don't get the answer they like are bad studies.
To the point, some people, I believe, think that's how science is meant to be, right? Like that argument is what science is. And I think it comes down to Glass's contention here, and I think really our contention as well, is that like that's not the case. All of the stuff is empirical, and science should be about the leaning on empirical proof of things.
That says more about scientists and the system of academia, I think, than about science.
Exactly. So moving on, he talks about this idea of a flawed narrative review. So there's bias, but he also just says here, essentially the meaning of a narrative review of 500 papers, the meaning can no more be grasped in our traditional narrative discursive review than one can grasp the sense of 500 text scores without the aid of techniques for organizing, depicting, and interrelating data. So, in other words, there's too much stuff to make sense of, basically.
What he's saying is reading 50 research papers on the topic and expecting to assimilate that information in your head is like looking at 500,000 rows of data on a spreadsheet and expecting to analyze it in your head.
Yeah, exactly.
That isn't sensible.
Yeah. And I think people try to, though,
of course
it's a very human thing to sit around and discuss.
That's why people still use spreadsheets, because you can open it and look at it with your eyes and go, oh yeah, that looks like it's really that one higher than that one.
Yeah.
But the point of science is to figure out ways to do that so that when someone else looks at that same thing, they will get the same answer you did.
Yeah, exactly. Reproducibility, right? And I think we're heading headlong into a reproducibility crisis again, but that's another story. So I just to finish off this section, I just wanted to mention this, which I thought was amazing, as his example of how there's too much stuff now to be able to process. He talks about the ERIC system, which is like some educational record keeping thing. And it's like, we have over 2 million document requests annually. I just thought that was amazing, because I think 2 million, I've seen some websites with 2 million per second nowadays. So if we're talking about amounts of information, this problem is only, orders of magnitude larger.
Yeah,
we can't even explain how much larger this problem is.
What are the chances that all 2 million of those results per second say the same thing? Yeah.
Exactly.
And if they don't say the same thing, what do we do now?
Yeah, exactly. So for the next little bit, he says it's frustrating that all the funding goes to people collecting new data. So, bit of an academic
whinging about funding is traditional in academic speeches.
You've got to do it. You've got to do it. More studies are needed, and if you guys would just fund us properly. Shout out to earlier researchers. He's saying, like, people have done narrative review with really big numbers of studies and tried to do an admirable job of it, and they've all tried to use some technique of summarizing numerically what's going on. Nobody just sits there and reads 1,000 papers on education scores and can just then write a story about them that's actually accurate to all those 1,000 papers. Like, you're going to remember one or two more than others. And that's just human, right? And then he starts talking about something you touched on a minute ago, which is vote counting. And I think that's an interesting thing to touch upon, because when people start initially talking about combining experiments, the first thing they generally move towards is vote counting. Can you talk about that and why it is, as Glass says in this paper, underpowered?
So vote counting is sort of the straw man alternative to meta-analysis. It's like the old-timey, if you're saying meta-analysis is at least better than vote counting as far as quantitative ways of summarizing papers are concerned. But vote counting is what would probably occur to you first off to do, where let's say you've got 20 experiments on a similar topic. I think that the color of a button influences how likely people are to click on it, and I've got 20 experiments where we change the color of the button somehow. And I'm going to have a look over all 20 of those experiments and see if I think, on average, they move the dial towards people being more likely to click a button, and therefore I can say with some certainty that button color is important. What you would then do is you look up the results of those 20 studies, and in vote counting, you just add them together. You say, okay, I did 20 studies, and I found 5 of them where the changing the color made people click on the button significantly more, and 15 where people didn't click significantly more on the button when we changed the color. So I've got 5 over here in the yes column, 15 over here in the no column, and so I'm going to say there's more no's than yeses, and that means that changing the button color has no effect. End of review.
Yeah.
That is vote counting. Now, the reason that this is underpowered is a statistical one.
Yeah.
Because each of those experiments found that either the button color change was effective or not, based on the parameters with which that experiment was designed. So some things about the effect size that they were looking for. If you change the button from white to bright red, that might get people's attention with a larger effect than changing it from light blue to slightly lighter blue. You can imagine that the effect of those two changes would be different. So that is one way in which these
this
experiments...
dowdy old blue. No, this shiny new blue.
I don't know.
I know, I agree. It's exactly what
technology people do with their time.
Well, no, it's a perfect example, because I think the thing that kicked off A/B experimentation was the blue experiment, right? For those who aren't familiar with what we're talking about here, so really crash course. Online companies are always trying stuff where they show you 2 different versions of the website to see which one works better. And this originally came from a Google experiment, which I believe is just, I want to call it the blue experiment, but I'm not sure. I'd have to find the name of the paper. But it was Yeah, we'll link it in the comments. It was like 16 shades of blue that they tested against each other. And according to them, then, like, after doing this whole tranche of experiments, like, they settled on this one that, like, increased their uplift by 3% or something, which for Google would be billions of dollars, right? So that's where it originally came from. And I think maybe we can do that as a journal club down the line. Might be worth doing. But in essence, that's what we're talking about here. So different blue experiments is actually a very apt example, I think. Sorry, please continue on why that's better. Yeah. So
I don't know how they combined all their experiments in that Google paper. We should have a look. But vote counting is one way. But as you can see, there are quantitative, statistical differences between the different experiments that you've run. So one is the effect. This is the whole point, right? You don't run the exact same experiment more than once.
Yeah,
they have differences. So one of them has a bigger effect size than another one. They might have a bigger or smaller variability in the results that you got. So for some reason, you might have a bunch of people in this experiment who are responding very similarly to one another. Maybe you've recruited a specific group, or you might just have added more and more people. So as you increase the sample size, generally you decrease the variation in the result, the overall result. So because of these properties, these are the mathematical properties that will relate to whether or not your experiment, this one experiment out of the 20, got a significantly positive result or not. So assuming you're using typical quantitative frequentist test statistics, one of these two things, the mean difference or the variation, will contribute to whether or not that particular study records a tick, yes, this worked, or a cross, no, it didn't. So you don't have to just add up the ticks and crosses. You can actually add up those mean differences and the variabilities. Yeah. And when you do that, the effect is statistically kind of like running all those experiments at once, in the sense that you can get the mean of all the effect sizes and a much reduced variation overall, because now you're considering all of these samples together. And when you do that, you can find patterns that you might not see by looking at vote counting, and most importantly, improved power. So maybe the reason in our example that 15 out of your 20 experiments didn't find a result is not because changing buttons isn't useful, but because in that situation for that group, the dial didn't move far enough for it to pass a significance test. So maybe you have a big effect size. People changed what they were doing a lot, according to the button. But maybe they changed a lot of what they were doing because you were suddenly giving them like a fluoro magenta button and they just weren't really sure. And so you introduced a lot more variation. And because of that variation, the test is not significant. So an example like that would go into the no column.
Yeah.
But actually its effect size, when added up with the other effects, would give you overall a result that says, yes, actually this does make a difference. But only in these circumstances. And then by looking across all of the studies together, you can also start to see under which circumstances it makes a difference, whether it changes over time, whether it changes with different populations. You can have a lot more to go on to then say, actually, I think button color is important.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And that's what this, like, the graph is about, right? When we've got the... in this case, he's breaking it up into different groups in a psychology study, which is the next study he moves into.
Psychotherapy,
yeah. So in the second one, he starts talking about effect size a lot more and those differences between groups, which is what that sort of figure 2 seems to be focusing on.
Yes. Yes, so here he's showing how by looking at results in aggregate, even when the experiments are different, what you can now do is look at subgroups and say, actually, I think this type of psychotherapy is more effective in these situations, which is the kind of thing that scientists would always like to do, but you can rarely get practically a study going that compares every single variation of every single possible input. I
mean, I've seen plenty of people try. It's hard to get that funding because it requires so many people. If you were going to compare, so in this case, in the case of the psychotherapy one, we've compared behavior modification, psychodynamic therapy, client-centered therapy, rational emotive therapy. You don't really need to know what they are, except for they're different styles of a doctor talking to a patient, right? And we're trying to figure out first, like, does any therapist talking to a person make a difference? And then if so, is one way of doing that better than others, right? Like that, that's a pretty perfect sort of question. And if you were to just design a study of that, right, like you can imagine, right, I'm going to put a bunch of people into each different one and I'm going to compare them all against each other. The analysis you'd normally do for something like that might be something like an ANOVA, maybe a regression, if you're being more sensible, because I don't think you should ever use ANOVA, but that's me. My point being that, I know, like...
let's not get personal.
My point being that this is a really good alternative to that, where you're able to use all this, like you don't need to get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people all together to do this. To the point that many meta-analyses actually report like individual participants of each individual study, right? Like, and it's always portrayed in the media as like an analysis of like 22,000 different industries.
It makes the meta-analysis seem much more impressive.
And it's like you didn't analyze 22,000 different things.
But if you are looking for a hack to sound more impressive,
meta-analysis
then meta-analysis is an excellent way to sound very impressive. We analyzed 13 million data points to get this result.
Yeah, it's so good.
Actually, we meta-analyzed 20 studies that had many data points each, which is a lot less work for us, but we still got all the good insights. That's the joy of meta-analysis.
It is. Look, to finish it off then, we've got, he goes into the problems that are affecting meta-analysis and like a kind of review and a conclusion of all of this stuff with basically, as far as I can see, I would summarize the conclusion as, and so do meta-analysis, right? Like that's basically it.
Yeah. I would like to read another quote, if I may, because there's lots of
There's
bangers in this paper.
This paper is great for that. There's so many good salty lines.
Yeah. But I think the sum up that we often see, as he says, is the call is sounded for better research designs, better measures, better statistical methods. In short, a plaintive wish that things were not so complicated as they are. But the perfect definitive study is a will-o'-the-wisp. And he says no educational problem admits a single answer, and I think most scientists and people in a technical role would absolutely
in any field
apply that
Yeah.
to their own field, right?
Yeah.
I've never seen a field of research that admits a single answer. We study systems and processes too complex and too interactive to give up their secrets so easily. And the variance in our findings of studies is essential and largely irreducible. This is Professor Glass talking. It should be viewed, and by this he means the variation between studies, it should be viewed as something to be studied in its own right, not something that can be eliminated with tighter designs or sharper measures. When 100 studies can be arranged to yield a half dozen answers to a question, we can feel confident that we are nearer the truth. And I think for me, that is one of the key points of this philosophy and this way of viewing research, that in science we are trying to get nearer to the truth. We are not saying we've done a study, we have the answer, we know everything now, we can move on and never think about that again. We see truth as something that we are constantly trying to understand. And by doing that, we have to look at what we already know as well as the next thing that we're going to find out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, I would like to say just one more thing, if that's okay.
Please, of course.
About this paper, because it is from the mid-70s, and we've talked a little bit about meta-analysis since then. And at the time, this was such a new thing, and it's still and kind of considered to be a niche science. But this idea has become so incredibly important to science. Now there are more meta-analyses coming out per day than Professor Glass would have seen coming out of primary studies in his day. This is a huge, huge area of science now because it works. It works so well. And there are lots of caveats to meta-analysis, and there are lots of things that people point out as problems with it, and they are problems with it. But one of the lovely things about scientists is they're contrarian, and it only takes one person to say, oh, well, that won't work because of this, for someone else to go off and figure out why this is not a problem, or why it is a testable problem that can have a number put to it. And now there is a whole mathematics around meta-analysis and how you decide if you can combine experiments and how you combine them and how you test whether your combination is right, how you assess whether that answer is likely to be biased, how you control and adjust for that bias, how you predict what the outcome of your next experiment might be. There are, within 30 years, 40 years of Professor Glass's publication, there are suites of statistical tools that you can use to address virtually any question that you have around this topic. So, in the end, this paper was the start of a scientific revolution. That's it.
Cool. I think that's such a great note to end on. Look, this is hopefully just the start of the discussion about this paper. Obviously, like everybody on any social platform, I'd love you to leave comments. Hopefully nice ones that are focused on methods and science, please. But yeah, we'll keep it going. And there's always other ways to stay in touch with us. So please hit the website, scientificmicroservices.com.
Tell us what paper you would like to do next. We have some in mind, but we like reading these things and discussing them. So this is a bit of a funny one because it's actually a speech and it doesn't have like a methods and results section and things that we can really dig into. But if you have papers that you want us to discuss, send them in.
Yeah.
Let us know.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.